Georgie, Porgy, Pudding, and Pie kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie, Porgy ran away.
We have different intro music, we have a different day we're going out, and we have a different title. Rob, are we losing the plot, or is somebody else losing the plot?
This is what we've been driven to, Rob. I just don't know. I think I'm just going to sigh, and then that'll be the podcast. Okay, so let's elaborate a little bit. But yeah, this is this episode comes to you courtesy of George Osborne, and yet another interesting little curveball he's thrown our way last week. So we thought that rather than wait until Thursday, we would sneak out a little extra episode because we know that it's something that everyone else has been talking about. It's something that we've been talking about between the two of us plenty. So I thought, well, why not flip on the mic, let everyone else hear us moaning as well.
Yeah, but before we get to the moaning and the implications of these changes, let's discuss the changes. So what's happened? Well, a lot. So much so that we hadn't planned a podcast. We just thought, we'll mention it in our news feature because he isn't going to do a lot this time, is he? How wrong we were. Again, we seem to get it wrong a lot with this government. So, the big news. Buy-to-let and second homeowners will be charged stamp duty at 3% higher than the current rate. So, for example, if the current rate is 2 or 5%, that would become 5 or 8%. How does that impact you? Well, massively. Before, if you had a property worth 100,000, there was no tax at all. But now, if it's over 40,000, there's a tax. So straight away, there's a new tax for properties that previously had no stamp duty. But even a bigger impact, if you have a property that's worth over $250,000, then the tax is huge. In fact, it can run into tens of thousands of additional tax. These aren't tweaks to the market. These are massive changes. And Rob, understandably, not everyone's happy about it.
Yeah. The chairman of the NLA, his quote was, "If it's the Chancellor's intention to completely eradicate buy-to-let in the UK, then it's a mystery to us why he doesn't just come out and say so." And I think the NLA have actually been pretty rubbish on a lot of the changes that have happened recently, but that quote is fair enough. I think we spoke on Wednesday night and you caught me at the peak of my sort of feeling picked on and being miserable about the whole thing. Cheered up about it now, but it was just yet another, oh, come on, really?
It is. I mean, we're going to come into what will happen from this because I was like you, but when it first happened, I had my head in my hands like, what has he done? But then with any of these things, you just have to look at what will happen in the market. And if you understand what's going to happen, then opportunities can arise. And we'll come into that. But while it may seem like doom and gloom, and tax is never popular, what it will present, for some people, challenges, but for others, opportunities. And that's why educating yourself and the fact that you listen to stuff like this shows that you can take advantage of these situations, which we'll come to. That's not the only news. There was actually a lot of positivity in there amongst the doom and gloom, generally in the property market. And the government and the Chancellor are particularly trying to get first-time buyers into the market and a lot of buyers, which is an important thing to remember. There's a lot of buyers going to be coming into the market.
Yeah, the headline figure was 400,000 new affordable homes by 2020. Half of those are going to be sold 20% below market values, copying your business model, Rob, to first-time buyers. And 135,000 of those 135 of the other ones will be shared ownership. And they're removing a lot of the restrictions around shared ownership. So basically, I think anyone will be able to do that. Yeah, the headline was doubling of the housing budget. So you never really know how much of this stuff will materialize. But building new homes, even though you might think it's against the interests of investors because constraining supply means higher prices. You can't really argue that socially it needs to be done. It hasn't been done properly for decades, and it's about time. So that probably does count as good news.
Yes, and a lot of investment planned for transport infrastructure, particularly the Northern Powerhouse getting mentioned again and more money going in there. So that's positive. But the thing that got me with this, Rob, tax is never popular and we don't like it. And it's understandably why, because it affects us. But it's the fact that it's not a tax for all. His rich pals Georgie's rich pals are going to be fine. Because if you've got 15 or more properties in a company, you're not going to have this tax. If this was a tax for all, so the people in the middle, the people at the bottom who are aspiring to become property investors, and the wealthy already, were all had a blanket tax where everybody was affected in the same way, then you could go, you know what? Fair enough. If that's what you want to do, it might not be popular, I might not like it, but at least it's fair. But it's not fair. It's not fair at all. It's a disgrace, actually, that the fact that people who are in a much more advantageous position already can take more advantage of the market. I've seen words like corrupt being used, and a lot worse. And I'm not quite as extreme as that, but I'm massively disappointed. And if this government wants to get in power in 4 or 5 years' time, and this particular man in particular, he's not going about it the right way. The only thing I would say is he's clever by making all the pain happen now and hoping we all forget. But don't worry, we'll keep the podcast going to remind you what a challenging person he is. There you go. Podcast friendly.
Okay, well, this is meant to be a quick episode, so we'll have to go easy on the ranting as much as possible and talk instead about the implications and our thoughts around it. So you go first, Rob. What do you think this actually means? We might not like it, but it's happening. So what's the result?
Well, last week, Rob, which is quite funny, last week's podcast was out of date the second it went live. What will happen to London podcast. And one of the comments you made was something on the lines of, what will it take to make London uninvestable? Oh, I think we just found it, because it was absolutely crazy before, but now this is the final nail in the coffin for the time being. And I'll explain shortly, but the tax on a £300,000 buy-to-let, which won't get you a lot in London, let's be fair, is now over £10,000. Depending on which calculation you use, but they're all over £10,000. People have different thoughts on the costs. But it's only over £10,000, which is absolutely bonkers. And it gets worse, obviously, the higher you go up. You get over 500,000 and it's just eye-watering numbers. I had a client, a podcast listener, who came into the RMP office yesterday, and he has 3 properties all off plan, completing in London after April next year. So he has an additional stamp duty tax. So this is not the total. This is on top of what he was already paying of over £30,000. So I won't name his name, but this guy's now got to find an extra £30,000 to pay for stamp duty on top of what he was already doing. So he's already paying a chunk, but now he's got to find another 30,000.
I thought I'd had a bad week.
Yeah, exactly. And I know there's going to be a lot of people, a lot of foreign investors in the same boat as well, who've been buying in London and off plan. So London is close to being uninvestable now. After April, I think it's going to take a big hit. Now, I suppose I'd better come to it at some point. But where's the money going to go? Rob, we were talking this morning. Last week, we were like, what's going to happen? And we've had time to digest it, think about it, and so on. But overall, while it's bad, it's not a disaster, because people will still want to invest. If London becomes uninvestable, then people are going to go elsewhere. I think Scotland could benefit if they don't bring in a similar tax. But actually, I think for those who want to stay in England, they'll go to the north. Because while there is tax, the impact of that tax is a lot less. Because if you're taxed at a couple of £1,000s, which admittedly isn't great, but after a year or so of rent, it's gone. And if you're in it for the long term, then actually that's not too bad. So I think the money will start to move north. Now, I think it's worth saying that our predictions episode is still coming out on Thursday, and we'll talk about exactly how we think these changes will affect things. But I think a lot of money will start heading north just because of the value. It's a bit like Adam Smith's invisible hand. People are going to see value elsewhere and the money will move automatically. He's on your £20 notes if you don't know who he is. And I'll link to a cool little video you can watch as well to explain the invisible hand if you're not aware of it, which will be in the show notes, which we'll call the propertyhub.net Autumn Shocker.
Yep, that'll do it.
Okay, so the propertyhub.net Autumn Shocker. I think people who flip, they don't have a nice time coming forward, because not only have they got the stamp duty costs to take a hit on, and yes, the capital gains, you can write it off, but paying it up front, your input costs have gone up. But also, Capital gains tax, you sneak this one in. Capital gains tax now, instead of being 10 to 22 months for when you pay it, actually now it's only 30 days after the completion of your property. So if you were thinking about reinvesting some of the profits and rolling it up and making more money, making your money working harder for you, unfortunately, your capital gains tax is going to be due within 30 days. So if people are flipping in expensive properties, then it's going to not be as attractive from April, unfortunately. And maybe looking at different areas for your strategy or a different strategy altogether might be the case. Rob, there's so much more to say, but what initial thoughts have you got?
Well, so many. It's hard to know where to start, but I think, first of all, looking at it from a political angle, I get it. I'm very sensitive to special interest groups moaning about stuff, because I think it's a very easy one to succumb to and be like, oh, we're so picked on. Why is everyone being so mean to us? And you get it in property, and you get the whole, oh, well, the tenant will end up paying argument and all that. And you get it in lots of other industries as well. And I really don't want to fall into that trap. What I do think, though, is that it seems like it's quite a blunt instrument to tackle what's a specific problem. So there are problematic things, such as if like when a new building is going up, it's immediately, well, before it's even gone up, it's been sold off plan to overseas investors, then that's a problem, right? It's a problem for the country. So that's something that needs to be sorted. But what about the small scale property investor or trader, like a lot of people who listen to this podcast, who are buying properties that are wrecks, that need a load of work doing to them, bringing them back into the rental market or bringing them back into the resale market so the property is suitable for first time buyers? Why clobber them at the same time? I mean, you're not going to get first time buyers doing that. So it just doesn't quite seem right to me. But like it or not, I mean, small scale investors are clearly a target for this government, and it's bad news for amateurs. It's bad news, especially with the changes that we saw in the budget around mortgage interest. Bad news for people who've already got massive portfolios and little equity. But for the rest of us, I think it is an opportunity, and that is something that I'm going to be talking about a lot more in the predictions episode on Thursday. This particular tax for London, it is probably, like you say, Rob, if not the final nail, then it's certainly going to cool things down, equalise things a little bit between the north and the south. For everyone else, I don't think it is a game changer. Like it seems to me like it's more of a signal than it is something that's really intended to move the market or raise a lot of extra revenue. So an extra 3% on the purchase price, if prices continue to increase at their long-term average, then you've made that back in under a year, probably more like 6 months. So it's not going to change things that much in that respect. And how do you collect it? There's going to be I don't think they know. It's another of these things where the announcement comes out, you look for the detail behind it and it's not there. There's going to be all kinds of complications with actually proving what's an investment in property at the outset and so on, especially with cash transactions. I think this is more of a signal and a push than it is anything that's going to seriously make changes. It's intended to cool things down. It's intended to take a lot of the people who aren't too serious about it and go, no, actually, I won't bother. But beyond that, I don't think it's going to make as much of a difference as perhaps I first thought. Yeah,
I'm with you, Rob. I've talked a lot, and we, as usual, we seem to come to similar conclusions. Not always identical, but similar. And I think this is a prime example of the magazine, the last issue of the Property Hub magazine. The lead article was about the disappearing middle classes. And I think George Osborne is really trying to accelerate this. And what's going to happen? It's going to be a divide. And people will get wealthier or people will get poorer. And the middle classes will reduce because of the policies this government's bringing in. Now, that might not be fair, but if you understand what's happening, you can take advantage. And that's what we'll talk about in next week's prediction episode. So we'll talk about what we think will happen, but if you understand what's going to happen, then you can take advantage of it. But what's really, really interesting for me, Rob, is I think this is the mid-cycle wobble. This is what we've been saying is coming up. If you refer back to the 18-year property cycle, if you don't know what that is, and you've not been listening to us for that long, we'll link to it in the show notes. Remember, go to thepropertyhub.net/autumn shocker. That's thepropertyhub.net/autumn shocker. But this wobble is then preceded by a boom. But remember, during the wobble, we've said this all along, so this is not rhetoric to suit an agenda. The media will get negative in the next 12 months. But actually, I think if you do it right and you go in and you do the right things, it could be an opportunity. And normally we are very balanced on our opinions. We're not like, we're all going to be rich or we're all going to lose everything. We're normally in the middle. But I'm bizarrely the most positive I've been, and you'll have to listen on Thursday to find out why, the most positive I've been in years about property. So we'll talk about it in a bit, because I think this is the next phase of the cycle.
I think this really, if things pan out as we think they will, it really rams home the importance of knowing about the cycle and just keeping yourself educated in general, which ties into the whole disappearing middle class phenomenon. Because the media will start getting negative about it. We're probably going to have a couple of years, I would have thought, before everything starts getting pumped up again in time for the 2020 election and everyone has to feel good about everything again. But when that happens, it's going to be very easy for people to panic, and a lot of people will panic because they'll think that it's the end of the world. But because we know what's coming, or we know what we suspect will come on the basis of history, we're not going to panic, and that means we're going to make much smarter decisions. And that's what's interesting for me. It's not just kind of, while on one level, most people will be looking at what's being said, taking it at face value and making a knee-jerk reaction off the back of that. If you understand the wider context and analyze it a little bit and look to history and all the rest of it, you can kind of see what's behind it and find the hidden opportunity in there. There's always an opportunity, isn't there? You can't just keep on doing the same thing forever. You've got to adapt, and you've got to make the right decision at the right time. But if you're able to do that, it's always going to be possible to profit. So
loads has happened this week, and this is why you got this special podcast. Never done this before in over 2 years. Never broke our scheduled cycle. So this is a first for us. So we can thank George for that. At least that we got something out of it. So Thursday is going to be a huge episode. Make sure you don't have long to wait. But Thursday's going to be huge, because we're going to take all of this, what's happened, and try and make sense of it all for you. And we're going to look forward to see what exactly we believe that could happen. Now, to be fair, when you make predictions, you often make yourself look silly. But we're not going to get into specifics of it will go up by this percentage point. But we're going to say generally what will happen. And to be fair to us, the last few years we've done this. We've been there or thereabouts. But we'll also, for a laugh, look back at last year's and see how we did perform on last year's predictions. So you can see whether you can invest any trust or hope in what we say going forward.
Yes, that's going to be interesting. So that's coming up on Thursday. We're going to be back tomorrow. How much of us can you take? With the Ask Rob and Rob podcast, as we always are on a Tuesday. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed our first ever special episode. If you've got your own thoughts on this, which I'm sure you do, there's a great thread going in the Property Hub where you can contribute your thoughts. We'll link to that in the show notes as well at thepropertyhub.net/autumn shocker. But for now, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.